Distinguished participants and colleagues, good afternoon. I'm here to represent UNESCO APSEU based in Seoul, Korea. For those of you who are not familiar with APSEU, it stands for Asia Pacific Center for Education for International Understanding. APSEU has been championing global citizenship education and its core values since 2013 and has worked hard to promote it in ways that can be embraced and practiced around the world through local contextualization. More recently, we have expanded beyond the Asia-Pacific region to include South Asia, Central Asia, and Sub-Saharan Africa to bring together the regional educational resources and personnel that allow the sharing of ideas, creative solutions, and expertise in education, with the expectation of making the concept of global citizenship education to become an everyday reality on school grounds throughout the regions. As a scholar, I myself have been studying how such an umbrella concept as global citizenship can transform our thinking about the future of humanity in ways that can also make education more relevant in the 21st century global context. I am certain that the ethos of global citizenship education has much commonality with what balanced and inclusive education espouses, and perhaps a united front will enable us to achieve new heights in the field of global education today. By the way, I have several hats that I wear day to day. I am, first and foremost, an academic scholar in the field of education and anthropology. I am also a practitioner of global citizenship education in the university, and I am at the same time the governing board member of UNESCO APSEU. Today, I would like to put on my scholar hat and share with you my overview of the educational realities in East Asia, mainly South Korea, which is my homeland, and Japan and China. As many of you may be aware, these three East Asian countries have occupied the top-tier position in international education assessment indexes, such as PISA and TIMSS. Well, I'm not here to reveal the secret recipe for such success. However, I do want to point out that much of their successes have been attributed to Confucian values and work ethic promoted through education. However, such a model of education that emphasizes discipline and perseverance is being pressured to change in favor of flexibility and creativity in the schools under the changing conditions of the 21st century. In fact, in South Korea and Japan especially, the 20th century formula for success is being criticized for its rigidity, and calls to replace it are gaining momentum. The faith in education investment and its correlation with economic success has been shaken in recent years, as the return on investment in education has plateaued in the two countries. In addition, both South Korea and Japan face declining population along with gentrification issues. China's fast-paced growth is accompanied by the lingering fear about the possibility of an economic slowdown and how it will impact the human resources development sector, which vastly relies on continued growth. Indeed, education in East Asia is slowly going through a paradigm shift. In the spirit of this forum, I would like to talk about some implications on how balanced and inclusive education can tap into the needs for an education transformation in the East Asian region. And by the way, when I say East Asian region, more specifically, it means Northeast Asian region. But I use the general term East Asian because I'm not including Mongolia or Taiwan here. So, okay, let's look at okay, there we go. Okay, first I'd like to start off by introducing you to some of the similarities among the education implementation and policies and the overall system in the three countries. Oh, it's working. Okay, first, similar trends in education. I've boiled it down to three areas. First is there is a faith in investment in education for national growth. In other words, national development discourse is very much intertwined with how we look at investment in education. But as I mentioned earlier, people are starting to wonder whether this is becoming a blind faith. So no longer is there a strong correlation between investment in education and positive outcomes from such investment. Second is all three countries have very highly centralized education planning and practices, including how curriculum is managed and how teachers are trained. Third is social and political commitment in all three countries. Education is recognized as a social undertaking that transmits societal values. Okay, similar problems in education. All three countries face similar problems. First is they all engage in what I call producer-oriented education. That is in opposition to the idea of consumer-oriented education, consumer being the students and the parents. What it results in is a more rigid system that is not flexible and not accommodating of the actual needs of the students and their parents. Second is the overheated competition and lack of second chance opportunities for early failures, as well as late bloomers. And this is mainly because of the high-stakes testing and also streaming and placement tests that occur at every stage of the schools, from primary to middle school, from middle school to high school, and from high school to college. Third is the growing and maybe overshadowing of shadow education, overshadowing the public education sector by private education enterprises has become a major problem because that challenges our principle of equity or bringing equity to the education sector. And at the same time, it threatens the credibility of and justification for public education. Okay, I've talked about the similarities. Now I'd like to go over some of the major differences. Again, I've boiled it down to 3 categories. I like the number 3. Okay, first, all 3 countries have slightly different philosophy and ideological priority when it comes to how they view education, especially whether to treat it as a social good or whether to see it from the perspective of individual rights. Second is attitude towards autonomy and accountability within the education sector. In other words, how do we accommodate the voices and reflect it into policy from various parties that have to do with certain interests, their staked interest in education. Third has to do with cultural and historical trajectories that have marked differences among these 3 countries. For instance, different experiences in colonialism, multiculturalism, democracy, etc. As you know, Japan was the colonizer, and the victims being China and Korea during the earlier part of the 20th century. So we have vastly different educational experiences in that sense. And also the history of democracy. In the case of Japan, for instance, democracy was implanted by General Douglas MacArthur right after the Second World War, and which has continued to this day. On the other hand, in the case of South Korea, we have had a brief democracy after independence, but then we had a long period of military dictatorship regime, which was toppled by democratic measures. And so naturally, people are very inclined toward political movements, and people are very familiar with voicing their opinions and expressing their rights in the political arena. On the other hand, China is still a socialist system under a very strict socialist policy. So these 3 countries have very different landscape, political landscape, and overall the cultural context. So given this context, I'd like to move on to what East Asia faces, and these are common challenges. Again, there are commonalities and then there are differences, but what they face in the 21st century, they will have to tackle their problems based on their context. So as a preamble, I kind of gave you the general context so as to facilitate your understanding of where maybe in the next 10 or 20 years, how things will change in East Asia in the realm of education. Okay, how am I doing with time? Maybe 4 minutes, okay. Okay, I'll speed it up. Okay, now from number 3, I chose number 4 because I had to add extra elements to forecast the future of education in this region. First, education is a product of school-society relations. However, many of you will agree that in a lot of cases, schools lag behind social change. And sometimes schools are the anti-agent to change. They may even resist drastic changes. Well, that has to change given the fast-paced globalization and the accompanying changes that come with it. Second is expansion of learning opportunities and improvement of educational content. Now, access to information is more democratic. More people have easier access to information that has not been that way before. Third, people are starting to recognize that the national curriculum as it stands today may not be applicable to the needs of tomorrow. In other words, what you learn today might not be useful in the future by the time your child takes a job. I mean, from the time your child enters school and the time that your child graduates and seeks a job, maybe the job market will have moved on and might look for different job skills or skill sets. Fourth, there is growing awareness that ethical coexistence rather than competitive zero-sum game as the goal of education will enhance the long-term sustainability of humanity. So we are starting to recognize the side effects of intense competition, which leads to a small number of victors and a larger number of failures, which again leads to low self-morale, low happiness level, and students disliking their own schools. Okay, I'd like to kind of conclude by looking at some of the new challenges and also talking about some notable changes in education in the 21st century, and that may serve as a premise for balanced and inclusive education. Again, 3 points that I wanted to make here. The national development discourse of education based on growth-first strategy, which has worked almost as a formula in the 20th century, is increasingly coming under scrutiny. Second, the focus of education has shifted from merely disseminating knowledge to helping creating new types of knowledge. Third, there is increasing pressure to expand the role of education to address global problems. And that is one of the main goals or main content of global citizenship education as it stands today. So why do such changing trends matter? Again, first, education is not a separate entity. It is a product of school-society relations, and long-term education plans should reflect these changing social priorities within the global context. Second, as I mentioned before, knowledge production and consumption are no longer the exclusive privileges of the few. In other words, the key word in the 21st century is collective intelligence. No one person rises above the rest in terms of knowing and being able to share this knowledge. It becomes somewhat of a level playing ground, and everyone has something to contribute to the general pool of knowledge. That is a new view on education. And also the growing awareness that ethical coexistence, this is the area that I've already mentioned, that the goal of education in the end has to enhance the long-term sustainability of humanity. Finally, we face new challenges today in the education sector. these 5 points that I see as major challenges, not just to East Asia, but to those who practice education across the globe. First has to do with new technologies. Since I don't have much time, I will just quickly present you with the key vocabulary. Second is problem solving abilities that go beyond national borders. Third is fostering tolerance and the ability to interact with others, those with different opinions and different worldviews. Fourth is the changing paradigm from a growth-first strategy to sustainable development. Fifth, it has to do with how to promote local tradition while at the same time defending from the penetrating forces of globalization. Okay, my final slide. I hope I'm not going over too much. Some possible areas for cooperation in promoting balanced and inclusive education across borders. 3 points I'd like to make. First is tackling common problems in education by sharing manpower, resources, ideas, and know-how from local issues to global issues. I'm sure there are numerous best practices that need to be discovered and shared. Second is fostering transcultural sensibilities to allow individuals to function in diverse cultural spaces and social fields. In other words, we are no longer looking at producing a next generation, a new batch of people who will only engage in their national matters, but now we have to train them to become actual global citizens. And finally, third, creating and utilizing a common pool of resources and incorporating different perspectives in various curricular development situations. And again, I think communication is the key because it allows us to embrace new ways of dealing with curricular development in other parts of the world. And by sharing this knowledge, I think it will greatly enhance how we look at national curriculum today. So that is my presentation, and I would like to conclude with this picture. This is a picture of a high school in Korea, and if you focus on the window, outside the window, what do you see? It's quite dark, which means these students are kept in school against their will to do more, after school work. And they're so fed up with it that they're just playing around and putting this picture on their SNS. So that kind of summarizes what kind of intense pressure these kids are under in the East Asian region. So this is my presentation, and thank you for listening. Thank you.